Oh, hi, it's me, Zack Peter, host of the No Filter with Zack Peter podcast, bringing you the hottest reality TV tea, spilled fresh all week long. So the LA Times just released a new article titled Tom Girardi's Epic Corruption Exposes the Secretive World of Private Judges, talking about how some key players in his embezzlement scandal are involved. So let's break it down, shall we? According to the LA Times, Tom would hire private retired judges to act as mediators to oversee client settlements. They'd essentially determine how settlements were dispersed and were assigned to ensure that there was no misappropriation of the funds, but to kind of keep everything clean and kosher. So one of those judges being Justice John K. Trotter Jr., he would receive a cut of the settlements as a fee for his services. These mediation services were supposed to prevent lawyers from dipping into client trust accounts and taking funds that weren't entitled to them. There's one settlement in particular that involves patients of a diabetes medication that suffered severe side effects. Tom represented them and won a $66 million lawsuit, which Trotter was the mediator of. Ultimately, he withdrew $15 million, which the Times estimates at 22% of the settlement earned, and he labeled them as costs. So $15 million in costs and fees for that case. Former judges like Trotter are now being accused of enabling schemes like Tom's at Girardi case by initially authorizing settlement transfers that were not appropriate and later not reporting him for fraud once they became aware of what was going on. If they became aware, because a lot of them are saying that they had no idea that any of this was going on. So these judges were paid up to like $1,500 an hour to assist on settlements for Girardi case, most of them coming out of a firm called JAMS, J-A-M-S, which stood for Judicial, Arbitration, and Mediation Services. So they represented a lot of retired judges, and these justices would now be brought in to help mediate some of these settlements to help, make sure everything stays clean, right? That was their job. Their fiduciary responsibility was to help make sure clients got all their settlements, help determine how much money they get, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The Times alleges that having these judges by Tom's side created an aura of invincibility, which is interesting since the latest Edelson lawsuit accuses Erica of being his aura of wealth. And they've even named her as a co-conspirator. Knowingly or unknowingly, they said that she was used as a front woman to keep the illusion of wealth within Girardi case. She was kind of the figurehead that they propped up to see, like, look, Erica looks good, Erica looks expensive, therefore we got money. We got it like that. The Times isn't fully convinced that all of the judges were fully aware of what was going on, mainly because, like I mentioned, all the judges now, or retired judges, are denying ever knowing what Tom was doing. How convenient. We all have pretend amnesia now. So my thought is, couldn't the same argument about Erica being a co-conspirator, couldn't that same argument be made for Trotter and some of these other judges that were involved? They were certainly more hands-on in these cases. They were the ones signing off on the transfers of these funds. But it's interesting that none of them are named in this Edelson lawsuit. Granted, to be fair, the Edelson lawsuit is specific to the Lion Air case. These judges were involved in other cases. It's unclear who the exact mediator was for the Lion Air case. I would imagine Trotter would seem like a plausible person to do that. I'm not sure who the mediator was for the Lion Air case. So that's possibly why none of them are listed in this, but we'll see. So Trotter responded to the Times claiming that he's always fulfilled his duties legally and ethically, and that he doesn't know anything about what Tom was doing, and he doesn't know when Tom morphed into the man he is today, this criminal that he is today. He's claiming that the real problem isn't with retired private judges such as himself, but it's with Tom Girardi. So it seems everyone is trying to pass the buck off onto Tom Girardi. It also, or the sentiment that I got in reading the article from Trotter, was that he wasn't even blaming lawyers in the system. He was blaming Tom Girardi specifically, saying that Tom Girardi is the person that did this, not lawyers, not private judges that work for JAMS, but Tom specifically. Okay, so I go back and forth sometimes, and you're probably going to hate me for saying this, but my brain just wonders. I like to play devil's advocate, and I have to look at everything from different angles, but everyone says that Tom did this all on his own, right? And of course, I mean, they could all be lying, but was Tom like deviously trying to steal from vulnerable people? Like, was he truly that evil? Or was it that he was just like, maybe he started to get a little more greedy and maybe he was addicted to the power and to the wealth and to the affluence, and it all just kind of got away from him? Like, I go back and forth between thinking, like, was he so diabolical that he was, I mean, the evidence against him is not good, because then you have him like hiring these case runners to find vulnerable victims to kind of bring them in. So like, I go back and forth and I'm torn, because sometimes I'm just like, it sounds like maybe it kind of just snowballed away, was he like truly that evil that he, or is it just that it got away from him and that he let things slip through the cracks and he found loopholes and he started jumping through all these loopholes and things got messy, and then eventually, because so many people enabled his behavior and so many people and nobody ever checked him, is it possible that it just got out of his hands and it snowballed into the giant mess that it became today? Because like, at what point did it turn? How did it turn? Why did it turn? In the words of Erica Jane, the only person that knows those answers is him. So, I mean, I guess we're never going to get these answers, but it's like, at some point there had to have been a turning point, right? Like, I don't believe he woke up or he grew up and he's like, I want to be a lawyer and I want to help vulnerable victims because I want to rip them off. Like, I don't think he went into it with that. So I'm like, what? Like, was it a certain level of money that he achieved? Was it a certain level of status that he achieved? Was it, a smoke and mirrors game of trying to keep up appearances? I'm sure it's a combination of all of these things, but it's just like the allegations go back decades, like before Erica. I mean, the cases that are talked about here in the LA Times go back into the 90s, which was before he ever married Erica. But I mean, we know he was eventually like starting to pay some people off. He was just really good at dodging a lot of them, and he racked up a shit ton of debt, and he was really bad at paying back his debts. But again, I want to know, where did it all go wrong? Because I feel like it had to have started, like there started to have been cracks, like way early on. No, because like a lot of people want to blame Erica and say that she's the reason that he got so money hungry, and she's the reason that he started spending so lavishly. But this man used to use his wealth to attract younger women. He used his power and his influence to push people around and to get what he wants. He was very much a bulldozer, but it just makes me think, like, when and how and just like why. And obviously all of these people, the lawyers that didn't want to stick up to him, maybe they were benefiting in some way. These judges that didn't want to stick up to him or didn't want to report him, they obviously are complicit in this as well. I think a lot of people very easily turn the other cheek, and the more they turn the other cheek, the more power Tom seemed to believe that he had, and the more influence he seemed to believe that he had, because the LA Times tries to make it out to be like, he kept all of these judges around him and would take them to parties and on cruises and would hang out with, Thomas Latin from the state bar, and he had all of these people kind of as like gateways, as gargoyles outside of his kingdom to scare people off, to be like, oh, I can't go in there because if I go in there, that gargoyle is going to get me before I even try to make it past the front gate. It's interesting. It just lots of questions to like contemplate and think about, because my brain's like, I don't think he was born an evil person and just decided that this was the route that he was going to go down, that he was going to find vulnerable people to take advantage of. I think at some point, either it was greed or power or desire or, I don't know, but some point there was a turning point at some point, and it continued to build to the point where it turned into this giant Ponzi scheme. Was it a Ponzi scheme he willingly started? Was it a Ponzi scheme that kind of started because he was bad at managing his funds, and then eventually he learned he could get away with it, and that's where it started to run off with him? I don't know. This is where my brain goes. You're probably going to hate me for asking questions and not just immediately crucifying him, but like, I actually want to know. I want to get into the mind of the criminal. Isn't that a Netflix series? Don't we like to get into the minds of criminals and like figure out like what happened and how we all got to be here? I have questions, damn it. Okay, there's another case brought into question involving a former judge, Jack Tenor, who was also a civil rights activist, and he did a lot of fighting for racial discrimination back in the day. Very much a pioneer in that sense. He worked with Tom on a case involving employees that were poisoned by a chemical plant owned by Lockheed, which is a security and defense technology company. This was back in the 90s, so pre-Erica now. Tenor worked with Tom. He was a mediator for Tom's cases. That case went on for 5 years and ultimately racked in $120 million in a settlement for the clients. However, many began to question the transparency of Girardi case as payments took forever to receive. One of them even claims that Tom tried to take advantage of the fact that these clients were elderly and ill, 1 foot in the grave and 1 foot out, as she describes it. She says that Tom tried to give them smaller settlements because most of them came from simple means, simple backgrounds, that he knew that if he threw $50,000 at them, that would suffice since it's the most money that they've ever seen. But Mildred, who's now a widow of one of those clients, she says that they're not dumb and that they knew that they were entitled to more of the settlement, and they knew that by the lack of transparency and by the dodging from Tom that there was something sketchy going on. She's like, he thought that he could just pay us a little bit of money and that we would be so happy with that we would just run off. She's like, but that's not, like, he took advantage of us. He used us to get all of this money and we're entitled to that money. So when the books were later reviewed in 2000, it seems that millions were spent on like vague and unclear fees, such as a $450,000 fee for an expert witness on the case. Notes were labeled as like confidential, or it was approved by Justice Tenor. So he was writing, I mean, he was keeping books. They just weren't the cleanest books. They didn't seem to be matching up. I mean, I think $450,000 to be an expert witness, that is a pretty hefty witness. Like, give me that job. I can be an expert in many things. I know how to Google. Give me that. Put some respect on my check. So Tenor was even caught signing orders to release funds from the banks to Girardi keys, from the bank to Girardi keys without the proper authorization of all parties that had access to the escrow account, because multiple people had access and multiple people had to approve or authorize the release of funds. Well, Tom pulled out $3.4 million that was signed, that he got Tenor to sign off on his behalf for. He soon after that tried to withdraw another $3.6 million, but that's when the bank was like, hold up, wait a minute. You just pulled out $3.4 million. Now you're trying to pull out another $3.6 million. We don't have everybody's signature to sign off on these. I get it. You have your justice mediator that signed off on this, but now you're pulling out too much money. And this just doesn't seem like, something about this feels off. And so they started asking about the previous $3.4 million. And they're like, well, where did that money go? And Tom's like, oh, that went to the clients. I used it to pay the clients. I'm a good guy. But they have no record of him ever using that money to pay the clients. You would know if the clients got that money, then there would be some sort of clear indication, or they would say, yeah, here's the check that I received on this date. Yet despite upset clients and despite now weary banks, Tenor continued to vouch for Tom. Those Lockheed clients claim that they still to this day have never received their full settlement money. And some of them have started to pass away. It's awful. In 2011, there was another case involving a menopause drug that affected 138 clients, all of whom are cancer survivors. They began raising questions about their settlement money and even hired a new attorney to go after Tom. Tom refused to give up his books and instead called another retired judge. This time he used Justice Edward A. Pinelli. Girardi Keys claims they withheld $1 million of the client's settlement money due to Pinelli's recommendation. Tom used this excuse on more than one occasion, claiming that his mediator, these former retired justices, these mediators would advise him against dispersing all of the settlement money, which if you consult with any legal experts or people that understand arbitration and cases like this, they would say that's not really standard. Like, there's no real reason that a mediator would advise against giving the client all of their money when the settlement comes in. Obviously take your fees and take, your commission, but there's no additional reason to withhold their money. It's also worth noting, though, that many of these clients that Tom represented were victims of awful, debilitating accidents like cancer, burn victims, so their shelf life, they weren't in the best medical condition. So essentially their shelf life was heading towards expiration. And it appears that he would entangle these things and fight them off until they unfortunately would pass away, or instead would just end up, giving up fighting with him because they would rather not spend their final days battling him in court. They would just take what he'd given them, make the most of what they had left, and just, live out whatever was left of their life. Tom fought off the clients that were illy affected by the menopause medication, as he did with many of them. He would kind of just keep giving them the runaround. And when they wanted to sue him, he fought to keep the case out of court, because obviously if you take things into court, things become public record. Other judges that don't have any interest are able to weigh in and make judgments against Tom. And instead of going to court, he wanted to go into arbitration with his buddy Justice Pirelli as the acting mediator. So Pinelli seemed to be aiding in Tom's mishandling of the money by backing him, and the court shot down that decision, saying, no, we're not going to approve Pinelli to arbitrate this case. No, you need to settle this case, and it needs to be resolved ASAP, and you're not going to allow, we're going to oversee this. Pinelli clearly is not, doing what we need him to be doing in this situation. It was later discovered that Pinelli was never officially appointed to the case originally at all, and that he never advised Girardi Keys to withhold any of the client funds. He claims that he only spent about 20 hours working on the case altogether, which was mostly in consulting, but he didn't do any of the heavy lifting. Apparently, he was just trusting Tom Girardi with all of the decisions and being like, all right, well, I trust you, Tom. Here, I'm just going to sign off on it for you on your behalf. He later revealed all of this in court after multiple attempts at dodging subpoenas to come and speak into court. He kept being like, I can't, I'm busy, I don't want to talk about it, I don't want to talk about it, I don't want to talk about it. Eventually, they dragged his ass into court and he was like, yeah, no, okay, fine. You want the truth? Here's the truth. I never told him to withhold that $1 million. I never really told him to do anything. I deferred to him. I trusted him and just signed off on what based off of the time that I spent looking at these documents and reviewing this case. I made the best legal decisions, and I made them fairly and ethically. And if you're upset, then you need to be upset with Tom Girardi. It was also revealed that not only did JAMS build, remember JAMS is the association that he was using to find these justices, or these retired justices, not only did JAMS bill Girardi Keys for $78,000 for this case specifically, but that Pinelli was also paid $50,000 personally for his 20 hours of work on the case. $50,000 for 20 hours of work. So the clients later discovered that Tom had already misappropriated millions of their settlement before even letting them know that the settlement money had even come in. So before he told them, oh, hey, your money's here, he had already received it and started spending it, or started dispersing it. Who knows where it went exactly, but it was described by the then appointed forensic accountant, because they're like, hold on, we need somebody to actually analyze this. And so the forensic accountant at that time described all of this as what seemed like a Ponzi scheme, which is interesting because that's what it's being referred to today. It was ultimately settled in 2016, but those records are confidential, so we don't know what the settlement actually was. But it seemed like he was doing this. He was settling these cases and, just kind of trying to move on from them. We also get into the Reslin case, which is where Tom misappropriated the $750,000 used to purchase the earrings for Erica Girardi, his wife. This case was also overseen by Trotter. Listen, I get it. It doesn't look great that Erica wants to keep the diamond earrings, but I think it's more gross that there were judges authorizing the release of those funds from a client trust account to buy the earrings. There was literally somebody that said, yeah, this is cool. Let me sign off on the release of these funds without letting the client know, without having any real conversation with the client, without guaranteeing that Tom had a system in place to pay that client that money. No, let me just sign off this $750,000 that Tom was asking for. I mean, it's interesting. These are lawyers that knew what was going on. And then you have Tom, who was knowingly taking that money from his clients to buy his wife diamond earrings. I think that all of these men are 100 times grosser for their actions that were actually directly affecting these clients and these vulnerable individuals. And I get it. Everyone has the argument of oh, well, if they didn't know then they definitely know now. Cute argument, but exactly, these judges and lawyers definitely know now, and they can assist in remedying many of these wrongs, yet a lot of them are choosing to stay out of it. A lot of them are choosing to plead the fifth. A lot of them are turning the other cheek, hiding their own assets, not forfeiting their own assets or the money that was taken, used to buy their lavish goods. I don't like that Erica wants to keep the earrings. I don't know why she wants to keep the earrings. That's on her. But I'm just saying there are other people that were more complicit in this that are not being held accountable or not being held to the same standard, that had a fiduciary responsibility. These are men with power, men with influence, men that were still directly involved in enabling Tom's behavior, men that were still practicing law up until very recently. Yeah, still practicing law, still out there, still possibly taking advantage of vulnerable clients and, helping their own wives. Interestingly, too, though, while all of this was going down back in, I believe in the 2000s with Trotter, the National Law Journal named him one of the country's most influential attorneys. The country's most influential attorney. That should say a lot if he was named the country's most influential attorney. So did they know what Tom was doing, or did Tom act alone, knowing that he had their trust? Again, questions that are up in the air. He would do this often, though. He would hire these retired judges to help oversee the settlements and then determine how much the client should get. He'd then seemingly get them to release some of the funds, which he would say were costs or fees. He'd then pay the clients some of their money, but not all of it. Then he would give them the runaround, blaming the mediators for why there was a delay in payments. He had this whole thing down to a science. Trotter, who was seemingly one of the most prominent figures in all of this, denies knowing what Tom was doing, saying that he would have disengaged had he known what was going on. He also blames the state bar for not catching Tom sooner, even though I'm pretty sure they'd be able to catch Tom sooner if they had, say, I don't know, the country's most influential attorney reporting him to the California State Bar for his misconduct. Sounds like the country's most influential attorney would have a lot more influence at the California State Bar if they were actually reporting this behavior. Interestingly, too, though, JAMS, the organization that Tom would pay and use to obtain and support from judges like Trotter and Tenor, is currently in line at the Girardi Keese bankruptcy with a claim on an unpaid bill from Girardi Keese. They received hundreds of thousands of dollars over the years, but here they are, currently in line next to cancer survivors, burn victims, orphans, and widows. They're standing right in line next to them, seeking their own bill of just under $10,000. I believe it's like $9,600 that they're seeking, that they say they're owed to by Tom Girardi. Because, clearly the hundreds of thousands wasn't enough to begin with. So nobody knows anything, but they're all lining up with their hands out. They're like, give me more, give me more, give me more. I don't know. What do you guys think? Did these retired judges really not know what Tom was up to? Or was it just more convenient for them not to know, as he would host these lavish parties for them and take them out on cruises and take them out to fancy lunches and dinners? Let me know what you guys think, because I have a lot of thoughts. I have a lot of questions, and I feel like I have more questions than answers at this point. So if you want more Girardi tea, you can always catch up in our deep dive archive with full breakdowns, expert opinions with a multitude of experts, from like Emily D. Baker to we recently had on Daniel Feruzin. We have a lot of attorneys, a lot of legal analysts, interviews with former Girardi Keese clients. All of those are available exclusively on the YouTube at youtube.com/justplainzack. Also, if you're watching this on the YouTube, don't forget to subscribe, smash that like button, follow me at justplainzack, or you can always keep up with the latest reality TV news at No Filter with Zack on the Instagram.